Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. Tonight's story is a little different from what you're used to on this channel, and I think you're going to feel that shift within the first few minutes. Our protagonist tonight is Vernon, 59 years old, a career baker from just outside Salem, Oregon. 31 years running the same shop. The kind of guy who measured his whole life in proof times and oven temperatures until the ground shifted under him 2 years before he was supposed to retire. Now, most of the men who tell their stories on this channel come to the Philippines already broken, and leave more broken still. Vernon's story doesn't move in quite that direction. I won't tell you where it lands, but I will say this. The way he handled what came next is the reason we wanted to share it with you. Before we get into it, a quick note. After hearing so many of these stories come through this channel, we put together a short guide based on the patterns we keep seeing. The good, the bad, all of it. It's linked in the description if you want to take a look. All right, here's Vernon, in his own words. I was a baker, 31 years. Same shop, same ovens, same 4 a.m. alarm that never once felt normal. Not even after 3 decades. You'd think a man gets used to that. I never did. My body just learned to hate it quietly instead of loudly. The shop was small. Vern's, if you can believe the lack of imagination there. My wife used to joke I had more creativity in a loaf of sourdough than I did naming my own business. She wasn't wrong. Regulars knew their order before they got to the counter. Old Pete took a cinnamon roll and a black coffee every single morning for 11 years. Never once changed it. I used to have it bagged before he was through the door. That was the rhythm of my whole life. Dough, proof, bake, sell, repeat. And somewhere in there I figured, all right, 30 more years of this and I'll sell the place. Take my pension, take what I've put away, and get myself a little spot on the Oregon coast. Nothing fancy. Just somewhere I could hear water instead of a mixer. Now, I want to be clear about something, because I know how these stories usually go on this channel, and I don't want you thinking I'm about to tell you I lost the shop or drank myself into a ditch. Nothing like that. What happened to me was quieter, duller even, which somehow made it worse. I had a financial advisor, man named Roy, different Roy, not the fella from down the block. This was a professional, tie and everything. And I trusted him for 15 years. 15 years. That's longer than some of my regulars have been coming in for coffee. He managed what I put aside outside the business. Not a fortune, but enough that, combined with Social Security and a small pension I'd built up, the numbers worked. Barely, but they worked. And then, about 2 years before I was set to retire, the fund he'd put a good chunk of it into just collapsed. I won't bore you with the details. I don't fully understand them myself, if I'm honest. Something about leveraged this and derivative that. All I know is 1 week I had a plan, and the next week I had about half of one. I didn't yell at him. I want that on the record. Some men would have gone down to that office and put a fist through something. I just sat there, nodded a couple times, said, "Well, I appreciate you telling me straight, Roy," and drove home. My wife had passed a few years before that. Cancer, slow, the kind that takes its time about it. So there wasn't anyone to come home and yell about it to either. Just me. In a kitchen that smelled like a bakery no matter how many years since I'd actually worked in one that day, doing math on the back of a receipt. Retirement wasn't gone. It just wasn't going to look like water and a porch anymore. More like, can I afford the rent on a 1-bedroom in the town I've lived in my whole life? That's not retirement. That's just being old and broke with extra steps. I'm not a dramatic man. Never have been. Bread doesn't care if you're upset. It still needs to proof on its own schedule. And I think 31 years of that teaches you something about patience, whether you want the lesson or not. So I didn't panic. I just sort of simmered quietly for about a year. There was a night, maybe 18 months before I actually left the country, where I couldn't sleep, and I was sitting up doing the same math I'd already done 40 times, like doing it a 41st time might change the answer. My buddy Denny, retired mechanic, half joking, says to me over the phone, "You ought to look at one of them expat channels. Fella I know moved to Ecuador on his Social Security alone, lives like a king." The first remember laughing at him. Told him I wasn't about to go live in a jungle somewhere because a YouTube video told me to. But you know how it is. You laugh at a thing, and then at 2 in the morning you're typing it into the search bar anyway, just to prove yourself right, just to see how ridiculous it is. That's really where this whole thing starts. Not with a woman, not with a scam, not with any of that yet. It starts with a broke, tired baker doing math that wouldn't come out right, and a joke from a mechanic that turned out not to be a joke at all. I want to say I went into it with my eyes wide open. I didn't, not entirely. Nobody does. But I went into it more careful than most, and I think that's the part of this story worth sticking around for. Denny's joke stuck with me longer than it should have. That's the truth of it. I laughed it off on the phone, said something like, "I'm not going to Ecuador, Denny. I don't even like camping." And he laughed too, and we moved on to talking about his knee replacement. But 2 nights later, I was up at 2 in the morning again, couldn't sleep, and instead of doing the same tired math on the receipt pad, I typed "Retire Overseas Social Security" into YouTube. Now I want you to understand something about me. I don't do things halfway. 31 years of baking teaches you that. You don't half-proof a dough and hope for the best. So once I started down that road, I didn't just watch one video and buy a plane ticket like some of the fellas I've heard about since. I spent months on this. Actual months. Spreadsheets. I made a spreadsheet, if you can believe that. Me, a man who still writes his recipes on index cards. There was a lot out there about Ecuador, like Denny said, and Mexico, and Thailand. But I kept circling back to the Philippines, mostly because of the language thing. I don't have an ear for languages. Never did. In school, I took 2 years of Spanish and came out the other side knowing how to say the bathroom is down the hall and not much else. So the idea that I could go somewhere and just over 90% of people speak English. English that's better than some of my regulars back home. Honestly, that mattered more to me than the beaches did. And within the Philippines, this town called Dumaguete kept coming up. Small city, university town, over on Negros Oriental. Every retiree channel I watched, somebody mentioned it. Safe, they said. Real expat community. Not just bars and, well, you know the kind of thing I mean. The Angeles City stuff, which I saw plenty of and wanted no part of. Dumaguete felt like it was built for guys exactly like me. Quiet. Boulevard along the water. A place where you could get a cup of coffee and not feel like you were being sized up the second you sat down. I did the numbers about 6 different ways. Rent for a decent 1-bedroom, maybe 15 to 20,000 pesos a month. That's around $270 to $360 in dollars. Food, cheap if you're eating local, more if you're chasing American comfort food, which, full disclosure, I did chase some of. There's a Jollibee down there, and I will admit that Chicken Joy is better than it has any right to be. Add it all up, and even with what Roy's mess had left me with, plus my Social Security, which after 31 years of paying in comes out to a bit over $1,800 a month, the math actually worked. First time in 2 years the math worked. So somewhere in there, and I'll be honest, I don't remember if it was before or after I'd basically decided on Dumaguete, I made myself a profile on one of those Filipino dating sites. Filipino Cupid, it's called, not exactly subtle branding. I told myself it was just curiosity. A widower, 58 at the time, poking around to see what was out there. I wasn't going in blind on that part either. On 500 read the same warnings you probably have. Fellas talking about girls who vanish the second the money stops. Girls who turn out to have 3 other canos on the string, same as you. I read a lot of that before I ever sent a message to anybody. That's how I came across Deina. 34 years old, from a town outside Dumaguete itself, up in the hills a ways. Her profile picture wasn't glamorous, which I noticed, and, I'll admit, that worked in her favor with me. Just a woman sitting on a porch step, with a cup of something. No makeup, no beach pose. Her bio said she used to work as a caregiver in Hong Kong, an OFW, and had come home to look after her mother. We started messaging, and here's the thing that really got me. She wasn't in a hurry. No good morning, beautiful, the first day. None of that. Some mornings, she wouldn't write until afternoon her time because she was helping her mother to a doctor's appointment or hanging wash. We talked about ordinary things. My bakery. Her nursing classes she'd started and had to stop. Whether adobo was better with vinegar heavy or soy heavy, which, for the record, she was right about. Vinegar heavy, don't let anybody tell you different. About 3 weeks in, I brought up, careful as I could, some of what I'd read online. Told her straight, I've seen stories about guys getting strung along. She didn't get defensive. If anything, she seemed almost tired by the question, like she'd heard it before from other women's experiences, not just mine. She told me about a friend of hers who'd been messaging 3 different foreigners at once, taking money from all of them, and how ashamed that made Filipino women look to outsiders. She said, and I remember this exactly because it surprised me, be careful, and not just with me, with anybody. I think about that a lot now. A woman warning you off her own country. Women isn't exactly the move you'd expect from someone running a con. Didn't mean I stopped being careful, but it moved something in me. Made me want to keep going instead of close the laptop and delete the app like I'd half planned to do more than once already. I landed in Dumaguete on a Tuesday in March, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the heat. Though the heat hit plenty hard, 33 degrees Celsius, and humid enough that my shirt was stuck to me before I'd cleared customs. No, the first thing was the smell. Diesel, mostly, from the jeepneys idling outside the little airport, mixed in with something sweeter underneath it. Grilled corn, maybe, or that charcoal smell from a barbecue cart somewhere close by. I stood there with my one suitcase like an idiot, just breathing it in, thinking, well, Vernon, you've really done it now. I'd booked myself into a place near the boulevard for the first month. Nothing extravagant, one of those extended stay apartments that cater to exactly my kind, retired canos, figuring out if they can actually hack it here before committing to anything longer. Rent was around 18,000 pesos a month, call it $325, and that included a little kitchenette I never really used, because there was a carinderia 2 doors down doing better pork sinigang than I could have managed anyway. I want to say I hit the ground running, but that's not honest. I hit the ground exhausted and a little scared, if I'm being straight with you. 20-some hours of travel does that to a 59-year-old man. First week I mostly just walked. Watched the tricycles swarm around like it was some kind of choreographed thing nobody choreographed. Sat at Cafe Antonio near the water more mornings than I can count, watching the Silliman University students go by with their backpacks, listening to roosters going off somewhere behind the buildings at an hour roosters have no business being awake. That's also where I started meeting other expats. Older fellas, mostly, some Australian, a couple of Brits, one German named Vernon who'd been there 11 years, and talked about Dumaguete like it was the only sane decision he'd ever made in his life. They were friendly enough. Some of them, I'd learn later, had stories that would have made good material for a channel just like this one. But that first month, all I saw was a bunch of retired guys drinking 3-in-1 coffee and complaining about the internet speed, which, fair, the internet speed did deserve complaining about. Now, Deina and I had been messaging for going on 4 months by this point, and we'd finally moved to video calls a few weeks before I flew out, which I want to mention because that's supposedly one of the red flags you're meant to watch for. A woman who won't get on camera. Deina got on camera the second week, I asked. No hesitation. Just her sitting on that same porch from her profile picture, mother's voice sometimes hollering something in Cebuano from inside the house, ordinary as anything. She came down to Dumaguete about 3 weeks after I arrived, took the bus from her town up in the hills, maybe 2 hours, and I met her at the terminal feeling like a teenager, which at 59 is a fairly ridiculous thing to feel. She was smaller than I'd pictured somehow, and more formal in person than her texts had suggested. A little shy, even, kept her hands folded in front of her for the first hour we sat together at Choking, of all places, because she said she wanted something familiar for herself before trying anywhere fancier I might have picked. She didn't touch my hand that whole first meeting, didn't lean in. If anything, she kept a polite little distance, like she was as nervous about getting this wrong as I was. It was maybe our third time together, over merienda at a bakery near Rizal Boulevard, bit of an occupational habit of mine to notice good pandesal when I taste it, that she mentioned, almost in passing, that her mother's blood pressure medicine had run low again, and the pharmacy visit would have to wait until her next pay from a part-time tutoring job she did. She didn't ask me for anything. She said it the way you'd mention the weather. I sat there for a second, then just said, "Let me get that for you," and she actually tried to wave me off, said, No, it's not your problem," which if you're keeping score is the opposite of what you'd expect from somebody working an angle. I insisted. Ended up being about 3,000 pesos, maybe $54, for a month's supply of her mother's losartan from the Mercury drug near the plaza. Small money to me, even with my situation. But I remember feeling something I hadn't felt in 2 years, since Roy sat me down with that bad news. Useful. Like a man who could still do something for somebody. Now, there's a term you'll hear a lot if you spend any time reading about Filipino culture, utang na loob, roughly a debt of gratitude, and I want to be fair here because I know how these channels sometimes paint it. It's not automatically a con. A culture that expects grown children to look after aging parents, that treats family obligation as something you don't get to opt out of just because it's inconvenient. That's not manipulation. That's just a different set of values than the ones I grew up with in Oregon, where half my regulars didn't call their own mothers on Sunday. I didn't know yet whether Deina's family would turn out to be the kind that took advantage of a moment like that. Truth is, in that moment, I didn't much care. I just knew it felt good to matter to somebody again. About 6 weeks after that pharmacy run, Deina asked if I'd want to come up to her hometown, meet her mother properly, meet the rest of the family. I remember feeling flattered, and also, if I'm honest, a little nervous. The way you'd feel getting introduced to a whole crowd at once when you're used to running a shop where you talk to one customer at a time. We took a habal-habal part way, and then a jeepney, the rest of the way up into the hills outside Dumaguete, maybe an hour and a half total, past rice paddies and these little sari-sari stores, every quarter mile selling the same 6 things: Coke, eggs, laundry soap, cigarettes by the stick. Her family's place was a modest concrete house, half-finished second-floor rebar still sticking up out the top, the way you see all over the provinces. Like everybody's always got one more phase of construction planned whenever the money shows up. Her mother hugged me before I'd even gotten my shoes off, which threw me a little. I'm not much of a hugger. Comes from 31 years of standing behind a counter where the customer relationship stays on the customer side of the counter. There were aunts, cousins, a couple of nieces who wanted to touch my arm hair, which apparently is a novelty over there, and a whole lechon, roast pig, laid out that I found out later cost more than most families spend on food in 2 weeks. I didn't know that going in. I just knew it felt like an occasion, and I hadn't brought near enough in the way of gifts, which Deina gently mentioned beforehand, so I'd stopped at a Gaisano on the way through a bigger town and grabbed chocolates, some toys for the kids, a couple bottles of tandwe for the men. Pasalubong, they call it. You don't show up empty-handed. I didn't know the word yet, but I'd have felt wrong doing it any other way, regardless. Between the lechon, the drinks, the chocolates and toys, I was out maybe 15,000 pesos that trip. Call it $270. Nobody asked me for a peso of it. I offered for the lechon when I saw them slaughtering it out back that morning, actually, offered before anybody hinted I should, and Deina's mother tried to stop me, said something about not wanting me to think this is why they invited me, and I told her, straight, I know that's not why. I want to do it. That's just hospitality working the way hospitality's supposed to. That was where I met her brother properly. A fella named Jun, mid-20s, sharp, funny, the kind of young man who'd have made a decent shop assistant back home, quick hands, quick mouth. We got along fine that visit. Talked about basketball, which every man down there seems to follow closer than I ever followed the Ducks. It was maybe 3 weeks after that visit, back in Dumaguete, that Jun messaged me directly, not through Deina, which I noticed, said he had a chance to buy a used tricycle, get himself set up ferrying passengers, and he was 50,000 pesos short, call it $900. Said he'd pay me back monthly once he was earning. Now, here's where I want you to understand something about a man who spent 31 years watching a bakery's books. You learn to read a request the way you'd read a recipe that's missing an ingredient. 50,000 pesos isn't nothing to me, not on my situation, not after what Roy did to my numbers. And a loan from a family friend to a young man with no track record, no collateral, no real plan for what happens if the tricycle needs repairs or the route doesn't pan out, that's not hospitality. That's risk. My risk, specifically. I told him no. Told him straight. I appreciate you asking me direct instead of going around Deina, but I can't do 50,000 as a loan. That's not a decision I make lightly. What I did instead, I offered him 10,000 pesos, about $180, outright, no expectation of it coming back. Told him, put it toward the tricycle if you want, or don't. It's yours either way. He took it. Said thank you, seemed a little deflated. And that was that, at least for a while. Deina never brought it up, never pushed on his behalf, which I noted and appreciated, though I couldn't say for certain whether that was character or just patience. Directly, not through Deina, said he had a chance to buy a used tricycle, get himself set up ferrying passengers, and he was 50,000 pesos short, call it $900. Said he'd pay me back monthly once he was earning. Now here's where I want you to understand something about a man who spent 31 years watching a bakery's books. You learn to read a request the way you'd read a recipe that's missing an ingredient. 50,000 pesos isn't nothing to me. Not on my situation. Not after what Roy did to my numbers. And a loan from a family friend to a young man with no track record, no collateral, No real plan for what happens if the tricycle needs repairs or the route doesn't pan out. That's not hospitality. That's risk. My risk, specifically. I told him no. Told him straight. I appreciate you asking me direct instead of going around Deina, but I can't do 50,000 as a loan. That's not a decision I make lightly. What I did instead, I offered him 10,000 pesos, about $180, outright, no expectation of it coming back. Told him, put it toward the tricycle if you want, or don't. It's yours either way. He took it, said thank you, seemed a little deflated. And that was that, at least for a while. Deina never brought it up, never pushed on his behalf, which I noted and appreciated, though I couldn't say for certain whether that was character or just patience. It was maybe 2 months after that. Things between Deina and me had settled into something real. I'd moved out of the extended stay place into a proper one-bedroom near the boulevard. 22,000 pesos a month, about $400, and she was staying with me most weeks, going back up to her mother's on weekends. We'd fallen into a rhythm that felt, honestly, better than anything I'd had since my wife passed. I'd get up early out of habit, even with nothing to bake, and she'd tease me about it, said I was still running on bakery time. Wasn't wrong. It was over pancit one evening, some noodle place near the market that did a decent bamai, that she brought up the house. Said it careful, the way she said most things that mattered. Her mother's roof leaked bad during typhoon season, had for years, and the family had been talking about maybe finally fixing that up proper, adding a small unit where Deina and I could stay when we visited. She said it like an idea, not a request. Said, maybe someday, if you wanted. I want to be honest with you here because I think this is where a lot of guys on this channel started sliding, and I felt the pull of it too. Part of me wanted to say yes right then. Sitting there with good noodles in front of me, and a woman I cared about talking about a future with me in it, that's a powerful thing at 59, coming off what I'd been through with Roy. Man wants to believe in something again, but I'd read enough by then, spent enough nights on those same forums since arriving, to know the shape of that particular trap. Foreigners can't own land here, not outright. That's the law, plain and simple. Every story I'd read about a guy putting money into a house on family land, in her name, because that's the only way it's legally done, ended one of two ways. Either it worked out fine for 30 years, or the relationship soured, and he was standing outside a house he'd paid for with no claim to it whatsoever. So I told her, gently as I could manage, that I wasn't in a position to build anything on family land, not with money going into something I couldn't ever legally hold a piece of. I said I'd help with materials for the roof repair itself. That's a fix, not an investment. Maybe 15,000 pesos. And if we ever wanted a place of our own down the line, I'd rather look at a proper lease agreement, something with my name on paper, lawyer involved, nothing built on hope. She went quiet for a minute. Not angry exactly. Said she understood, but there was something in her face, a kind of hurt I hadn't seen from her before, like she'd expected more from me and gotten a contract instead of a commitment. We didn't fight about it. Filipinos don't tend to, not directly, not in my experience anyway. It's more a kind of distance that creeps in, polite as ever on the surface. She still came down that weekend, still cooked. But something had gone quiet between us that hadn't been quiet before, and I lay awake that night wondering if I'd just done the smart thing or the thing that was going to cost me her. It was maybe a week after that dinner, things still a little cool between Deina and me, but nothing broken, that I ran into Gary at Cafe Antonio. Gary's a Brit, been in Dumaguete going on 6 years, and we'd gotten friendly over enough 3-in-1 coffees that he asked what was on my mind. because apparently I wasn't hiding it as well as I thought. I told him, in general terms, about the roof, the house talk, the way I'd handled it. And Gary just kind of nodded slow, the way a man does when he's heard a story before and doesn't love where it's going. Said he'd been through near enough the same thing 4 years back. Different family, different setup. But the shape of it was identical. Girlfriend's brother needed help with a business. Small ask first, he gave it. Then a bigger one. Then the girlfriend herself started needing things. Medical bills that kept recurring in a way that never quite added up if you looked close. And by the time Gary caught on, he'd put close to 400,000 pesos into that family, north of $7,000, and the relationship ended about 6 weeks after the money stopped. Not with a fight, he said. Just silence. She stopped answering, moved back to her province. He never even got a real goodbye out of it. He wasn't trying to scare me, I don't think. Just talking, the way retired men do over bad coffee. But it sat with me the rest of that day and into the night. I kept turning it over, not because I thought Deina was running some kind of operation. I didn't think that. Still don't, honestly. But Gary's story made something clear to me that I'd been sort of avoiding looking at straight on, which was that I'd already said no once to Junjun, and here was the family circling back around to a bigger ask, framed softer, wrapped in something that felt more like love than like a request. And I didn't actually know where that pattern stopped, if I didn't stop it myself. So I did something I probably should have done earlier. I asked Deina if we could go up and see her mother together, just to talk. No occasion, no lechon. She said yes, a little surprised, maybe a little wary, too. We sat in that same front room, her mother, Deina, me, a couple of the aunts hovering near the kitchen doorway pretending not to listen, which, fair play to them, everybody does that everywhere. I said my piece as plain as I could manage, told them I loved being part of their family, that the pasalubong, the dinners, helping with the medicine, all of that I was glad to do and would keep doing. But I told them I wasn't in a position to fund a house or cover every emergency that came along, that my situation back home wasn't what people maybe assumed Akano's situation was. I told them straight, I'm not an ATM. I can be generous. I can't be endless. Deina translated some of it into Cebuano for her mother, though I think her mother followed most of my English fine. Most of them do. Nobody argued with me. Nobody got upset in the room. Not that I saw. But something shifted in the air. The kind of quiet you get in a bakery right after you've told a regular you're out of their favorite thing. Polite. A little strained. For about 3 weeks after that, things were cool. Deina still came down most weekends, but there was a distance in it. Phone calls shorter. Texts a little more formal again. Back to how she'd been before we ever met in person. Junjun stopped messaging me altogether. I remember lying awake more than one of those nights, wondering if I'd just protected myself right out of the only good thing I had left. Wondering if Gary's warning had made me overcorrect into being the kind of man who counts pesos instead of loving somebody properly. I didn't chase it, didn't apologize for what I'd said, because I didn't think I had anything to apologize for. I just kept showing up the way I had been. Kept the pandazol I'd started baking for the neighbors going. Kept inviting Deina down like nothing had changed on my end, because nothing had. And then, slow, almost too slow to notice happening, it started easing. Her mother sent pandazol back to me once through Deina, home-baked, not near as good as mine if I'm honest, but the gesture wasn't lost on me. Junjun messaged again, this time just to ask about basketball scores. Davina started staying longer on weekends again, laughing easier. I didn't get a big apology or a dramatic moment where anybody admitted anything. It just got warm again, gradually, the way dough comes back to life once you stop handling it too rough. Followed most of my English fine. Most of them do. Nobody argued with me. Nobody got upset in the room, not that I saw. But something shifted in the air after that, and I've told you already how the next few weeks went. The cold spell, Junjun going quiet, then the pandesal coming back through Davina, home-baked, not near as good as mine, and things easing up slow, the way dough comes back to life once you stop handling it too rough. I want to bring this up to where we are now, because I know that's what folks watching this probably want to hear. Davina and I have been together going on 3 years now. We're not married, not yet anyway. Though I won't say it hasn't crossed my mind more than once. We live in a rental near the boulevard, not the fancy end of it. 28,000 pesos a month these days, a little over $500, 2 bedrooms, ceiling fan in every room because the aircon bill would eat me alive otherwise. Between my Social Security and what's left of my savings after Roy's mess, plus a little stall I've got going now selling pandesal and ensaimada to the expat crowd and a few of the local families who've gotten a taste for what I do, different from the local bakeries. We get by fine on around $1,600 a month total. Not king money by American standards. Down here, it's a good life. I've got a roof that doesn't leak, a woman I care about, and hands that get to do something useful most mornings, same as they always did. Junjun's got his tricycle now, by the way. Saved up the rest himself over about a year. Never asked me for another peso toward it. Runs a route up near the university. We're friendly. Not close, not the way I once pictured, but friendly. And that's enough. I think about what I'd tell a man in my position, sitting up at 2 in the morning doing math that won't come out right. I'd tell him, go ahead. Come look at this place. There's real good here, real people, real love even. Not all of it a con, the way some of these channels make it sound. But I'd tell him to decide, before he ever gets on that plane, what his limits are. Write it down if he has to. Because once you're sitting across from a woman you care about, in a house full of people who've welcomed you in, it gets hard to remember what you decided back home in the quiet. The moment it matters most is exactly the moment you're least equipped to think straight. Decide early. Hold the line gentle, but hold it. And watch, real close, what happens to the people around you when you do. That's the whole of it, far as I can tell. No dramatic ending. Just a baker who came out here broke and scared and found something worth staying for because he didn't hand over the keys to get it. And there you have it. Vernon's story, from a bakery in Salem, Oregon, to a rental near the boulevard in Dumaguete, 3 years running now. Not every story on this channel ends the way this one did, and we've been honest with you about that from the start. But Vernon's approach, the boundaries he set, the way he watched how people responded to those boundaries, rather than just their words, that's worth sitting with. Stories like Vernon's are why we put this guide together. Everything we've learned from the people who've shared what went wrong, all in one place. It's in the description if it's something you need. Thanks for spending this time with us. This has been Inside the Philippines. We'll see you in the next one.